Yes, my name is Kenneth Loch. Just want to get into what I'm calling genius self-realized. So the nature of self-realization, somebody who becomes self-realized, and then the idea of what they realize themselves to be, and then so the idea of when it comes to genius, who I'm claiming to be is actually the self-realized genius. So the idea there is that from that realization, it should be in relation to what a genius is, and then the idea that you don't want to become a self-realized genius of, say, I don't know, something, but it needs to be in relation to what a genius becomes ultimately. And I'm claiming to be in a sense, the first one, and maybe the only one. And let's see. So now, one thing I want to get into is the idea is that who has been, say, self-realized in the past, and how they come about their self-realization. So the idea is that ultimately, for, say, myself to back up my claim of being self-realized, ultimately I have to back it up. And the nature of that would provide, say, an educational value. And so the idea is, like, historically, we can go back to say Jesus the Christ, say, and then say Buddha, and then the idea of their self-realization. So when did like Jesus become self-realized, and then how that actually came about itself, and then the idea of say Buddha, when Buddha came into his self-realization. And what I can bring to the table is that, the idea of that in relation to the concept of enlightenment. So the idea is that, let's see, so the nature of, say, the fact that I became enlightened, and the idea, did Jesus become enlightened? And then the idea of, what did he become enlightened to? And then what brought him to, say, the point of being, say, an enlightened, say, Christ, say, and then what that means. And then the idea with Buddha, I mean, they equate Buddha Buddha, I think it means enlightened one. So the idea of his enlightenment, and in relation to the idea of, what people were at, say, this time that they were not aware of, and then ultimately the enlightenment, say, that Jesus and Buddha would have witnessed, would provide the means for, say, an evolution of consciousness. And then that's my self-realization and my enlightenment was the result of our evolution. And let me get into it here. The idea that it turns out genius, it ultimately has been recognized through philosophy, and in particular the philosophy of aesthetics, and the idea that the nature of a genius, and then like the concepts of, like, the truth and beauty and all that. And so the idea of, historically, we have not had a genius to actually make reference to. Well, there's probably been a few artists that have been referred to as geniuses, but the idea is that there's not really that much to back up their claims, and the idea that if they were a genius and self-realized, ultimately they would be able to profess, say, that they who and what they are, and again, would provide an educational value. Um, so, um, so when it comes to the 20th century and the abstract art movement, abstract expressionism, that there was an evolution there through the 20th century, and the idea is that who I'm claiming to be is the last of the line, the cutting edge, the avant-garde, and then the idea that with that, the being the end, the idea that the meaning, so that to understand something's end, like in itself, say, you would understand its meaning. And then I'm actually here, being the self-realized genius. I represent, say a professor, a teacher who has the authority to profess and teach the meaning, in a sense, firsthand knowledge of it, based on the fact that my participation with, say, the fine art of painting, and just had what it took to actually, again, like bring it full circle, and then ultimately I can explain the enlightenment in relation to, like, say, a transcendence. So the nature of the transcendence in relation to, say, the object or the product of painting, say, and then the idea that what I was able to do is transcend, say, the object, and understand painting from the perspective of not the object, say, or the end result, but ultimately through the process. So the actual process of painting, and how that would represent the means for us to understand the spiritual or metaphysical nature, say, in relation to painting. So when it comes to that nature, who I represent is kind of the painter who, in a sense, hits the bullseye, when it comes to kind of nailing that in relation to the production of a painting, say. And the idea that, like, similar to, like, the works with Jackson Pollock, and the idea that he would be a great example for me to use. Appreciate what he contributed to the 20th century, and the idea that ultimately he's now providing me with a reference to understand that history. And then going back, I make reference to, like, Kandinsky. He actually coined the term non-objective art, or non-objective painting, so going beyond the non-object, and the idea that, ultimately I didn't read the book, but he actually wrote a book called The Spiritual in Art. And so he both, say, Kandinsky, say, and Pollock, I would have to say that they were on the cutting edge of that evolution that led up to, say, myself. Let's see, and then the idea, the spiritual or metaphysical, and how that pertains to, say, painting, and then how it pertains to music and dance. So the idea that self-realized genius, they'll actually reach the point of where they understand this stuff, the nature of being interdisciplinary. So ultimately I represent, say, the first interdisciplinary genius. So the perspective of my genius would be based on interdisciplinary perspective, and then how that would be opposed to, say, a specialized perspective that ultimately, historically, that's what we've had. In a sense, ultimately I'm going to make this perspective. It's kind of interesting, because it's the idea that, like Jesus, he made the blind to see. Ultimately, I'm here to make it possible for artists to ultimately perceive the nature of the interdisciplinary, and ultimately become it, which would require them to ultimately become, say, anti-specialization, just go in the other direction, kind of like, ultimately, turning your back on it, like biblically Lot, and walking with this interdisciplinary perspective. And the idea is that ultimately how that would, for the 21st century now, would represent the means for, just say, each individual to reach their highest potential when it comes to the arts. And then if we can collectively come together on this, then the idea of how collectively, say, we would ultimately enter into this renaissance, and this perspective would be taught in our, say, educational systems up to the university level, say. And I'm ultimately here to reform our educational system into this interdisciplinary perspective. So, a self-realized genius, yeah, this is what the job that's given to a self-realized genius. And the idea is that ultimately, with what my understanding and everything we can actually use. So once you realized my genius, it can be used as to measure, say, a person's relative development, say, and then ultimately to be able to, say, discern, say, other claims of people being, professing, or somebody claiming that somebody's a genius. So the idea that ultimately, I'm here to say now that ultimately if a person claims to be a genius and it has nothing to do with fine arts, ultimately they're not a genius. And the idea of, like, say, like historically, like, say, an Einstein being referred to as a genius, it's kind of funny. So the idea that was Einstein a fine artist? No. And then ultimately, again, it's just like a genius is a genius. A genius is a genius of the fine arts. And then when you make a genius a genius of, say, science, it's not a good thing. It's not something that should be supported or promoted. It's actually degenerative. And then the likes of, say, when it comes to the arts, and then somebody who's recognized as a genius, say, like when it comes to, say, like Bob Dylan, say, I mean, he's been recognized as, say, a genius. And the idea there is that like Bob Dylan, when it comes to, say, the fine art of painting and say that evolution through the 20th century, he did not participate. So when it comes to painting, his genius has really nothing to do with his participation with painting. And ultimately it just pertains to, say, music and his ability to write songs, which I and probably many people appreciate. But the idea is that when it comes to, say, defining Bob Dylan as the genius or a genius, it would be good to ultimately recognize who I am, to really have a good perspective on making that, say, judgment call, say. See if there's anything else. Yeah, and it's interesting enough, when I mentioned interdisciplinary, I'm also claiming to be the genius through athletics. So through, the idea is that my participation was, say, with tennis. Turns out tennis, from my perspective, from a genius perspective, it's recognized as an exercise, a mind-body exercise. And and the idea of, like, kinesiology and all that. And that's what I have a project called Tennissance, or the Tennissance method. So I got some stuff on my plate, And also, I'm a singer, songwriter, musician, and all that, so I mess around with that. Yeah, just wanted to put this down. I think it'd be good for me to have done this, and I hope you got something from it. Thank you.